Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving into a source text that does something pretty fascinating. It applies an ancient ethical framework to the leaders and systems of the 21st century. Okay, so let's jump right in. The source we're looking at today asks this really provocative question, right? It's like, what happens if you take the ethical teachings attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and you hold them up against our modern politics and economics? It's a fascinating thought experiment, so let's see where it goes. So we're going to break this down into four main parts. First, we'll look at the moral standard the source sets up. Then, how it applies that to political speech. After that, its take on our economic systems. And finally, we'll get to its big conclusion. All right, first up, the ancient moral standard. The source kicks things off by laying out its core idea. And it's all built on this one, pretty radical principle for how to measure a society. And here it is. This quote is what the source puts right at the heart of its argument. It's framed as the ultimate yardstick, you know? It says the real test isn't about power or money or status. It's simply about how you treat the least of these, the most vulnerable among us. I mean, that's a complete flip of how we usually think about success, right? Okay, so now let's see what happens when the source takes this standard and applies it to something very modern, political rhetoric. To set the stage, the text brings up this core ethical command. And the analysis really hinges on one word, neighbor. The point it makes is that this isn't just about being nice to people you like or people in your circle. It's meant to be universal. And then, the source puts that principle right up against this. A 2015 quote from Donald Trump talking about migrants. Okay, and this is where the analysis makes a really critical point. The source argues that this kind of language isn't just an opinion you can agree or disagree with. No, from the perspective of its ethical framework, this is labeled as dehumanizing language. It's seen as a direct assault on human dignity itself. And to back this up, the source introduces another idea, mercy. The argument it builds is that whether you're looking at it from a democratic point of view or the Christian framework it's using, racism isn't just some abstract policy debate. It's seen as a core violation of what it means to be human. So, from political speech, the analysis broadens its scope and takes a hard look at the very structure of modern capitalism. Okay, to get what the source is talking about here, we need to know this key term that it brings up from the Gospel of Matthew, mammon. And this is the warning the source uses to frame its whole critique of what it calls turbo-capitalism. The idea here is that mammon represents a system where the logic of the market, profit, growth at all costs, becomes the ultimate goal, sometimes even pushing aside basic concerns for human rights and dignity. And as an example of a more modern economic viewpoint, the text brings in this quote from Elon Musk. And then, boom, it contrasts Musk's statement with this, very famous line. Now, the source is really clear here. It says, this isn't about class envy or being against wealth itself. It's presented as a structural critique. It's a warning about systems that create such extreme concentrations of wealth that it can become, from this perspective, a real moral problem. Okay, so this all brings us to the final part of the source's argument. After looking at words and after looking at systems, how does it say we should judge them? What's the final measure? This really puts the central conflict in black and white, doesn't it? On the one side, you have the ethical principles the source is using, things like caring for the weakest, fundamental equality, solidarity. And on the other side, it lists what it sees as the results or fruits of our current system, things like platform monopolies, extreme wealth concentration, and so on. The source is essentially arguing these two columns are in direct opposition. And this line? The source presents this as a radical challenge to any system, political, economic, you name it, that creates and justifies hierarchies, putting some people on top and others at the bottom. So where does this all land? Well, according to the source, it's not just an intellectual exercise. It ends with a demand for responsibility. And that demand is aimed directly at the people with the most power, the wealthy, political leaders, the people who run the major platforms. And this is really the bottom line, the final takeaway from the source. It argues that the real way to measure a leader or a system isn't by looking at their tweets or their stock prices. It all comes back to that first principle. It's about the fruits. It's about how that society actually treats its most vulnerable people. And so the text leaves us with this final, really provocative question. It basically turns its entire method of analysis around and points it right back at us. And that's where we'll leave it for this explainer.